August 1943. The sun scorches the tin roofs of a remote prison compound on the Philippine island of Luzon. Dust swirls across the parched yard, carried by the humid wind that smells faintly of rust, sweat, and despair. Inside the bamboo fences of Cabanatuan prison camp, thousands of American prisoners of war move slowly under the gaze of Japanese guards, hollow-eyed. Skeletal men in tattered khaki shirts, their dignity stripped as thoroughly as their freedom. And yet, on this day, something unusual is happening. The guards frown, their brows furrowing in confusion. Across the yard, a group of gaunt prisoners are marking the dirt with sticks. Others are carving crude wooden bats from scrap lumber. A ball, hand-stitched from socks and leather fragments, is tossed gently from one man to another. Then, a sharp voice cuts through the air. "Play ball." The sound of a makeshift bat cracking against the ball echoes like defiance itself. The Japanese soldiers, accustomed to order and obedience, stare in disbelief. Their captives, beaten, malnourished, humiliated, are laughing, cheering, competing, playing. To the guards, this is madness. To the prisoners, it is salvation. U.S. Army POW Camp Log, 1943. The game begins with no umpire, no scoreboard, no crowd. Only the sun, the dust, and the distant buzz of cicadas. A runner sprints toward an imaginary base, his bare feet kicking up sand. Another dives to catch Arab ball, the laughter around him rising like a rebellion of spirits. Each swing of the bat carries something sacred, a rhythm of America itself, a reminder of home, and a silent act of resistance against despair. Baseball had always been more than a game to the American soldier. It was tradition, brotherhood, identity. Even before Pearl Harbor, Major League stars like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams filled the headlines, symbols of a nation's spirit. When war erupted, the game followed the men overseas, to airfields, jungles, and carriers. Wherever Americans fight, baseball follows, one newspaper wrote in 1942. Chicago Tribune, February 1942. But now, on the other side of the world, inside a Japanese POW camp, that same game became a weapon, not of violence, but of defiance. The Japanese commandant, Captain Mori, watched these games with cold suspicion. To him, such behavior was undisciplined, perhaps subversive. He saw men who should have been broken now smiling. The guards whispered among themselves that the Americans were plotting or mocking their captors through strange rituals. Dramatized composite based on survivor accounts. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. The prisoners were fighting for something far deeper than escape. They were fighting to remain human. Conditions in the camp were brutal. Malnutrition, malaria, and beatings took lives every week. By late 1943, over 2,500 men had perished from disease and starvation. U.S. Army Medical Report, 1946. Every morning began with roll call at dawn, where the weak collapsed under the weight of the humid air. The Japanese guards barked commands and forced the prisoners to bow. But after the day's forced labor, digging, hauling, cutting, came the hour the men lived for, baseball. With each inning, the Americans reconstructed fragments of the world they had lost. They formed teams named after hometowns and service branches, the 1st Air Corps Flyers, the Navy Yard Sluggers, and the Texas Longhorns. They built makeshift bases from rice sacks, gloves from canvas, and an umpire's mask from wire and cloth. POW Memoir, From Cabanatuan to Freedom, 1947. The guards couldn't comprehend it. To them, sport was a state ritual, bound by discipline and hierarchy. The Japanese military encouraged kendo and sumo, tests of endurance, obedience, and spiritual harmony. Baseball, though introduced to Japan decades earlier, was still seen through the lens of order and precision. But here in the camp, it looked chaotic, undisciplined, yet strangely powerful. When one American hit a long line drive that sent prisoners cheering and running wildly, a guard raised his rifle. The laughter stopped. Silence. Then the guard lowered the weapon, muttering under his breath. The game resumed, slower this time. But it continued. Cabanatuan Camp Diary, Survivor Entry, August 1943. For the prisoners, this was more than sport, it was code. A message to one another. We are still men. We are still alive. Every game reminded them of front porches, small-town fields, and summer nights, the America that existed beyond barbed wire. Some Japanese officers, perhaps intrigued by the sight, began allowing limited games on Sundays, believing it improved morale and compliance. They thought it made the prisoners easier to manage. What they didn't realize was that they were enabling something that gave the Americans psychological strength, the very thing Imperial Command tried so hard to crush. Captain Mori noted in his daily report that American prisoners demonstrate strong group cohesion through recreational activities, notably baseball. This behavior is unmilitary but persists. Japanese camp log, September 1943, translated post-war. Those words reveal what the guards never truly understood. Baseball wasn't defiance of command. It was defiance of despair. Meanwhile, outside the fences, the Pacific War was shifting. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. The Allies were gaining ground in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The tide was turning, though the prisoners at Cabanatuan could only guess. Rumors drifted in through new arrivals, whispers of victories, of bombers appearing in the skies. Each rumor became another inning in their game of endurance. Inside the camp, officers like Lieutenant Tom Tex Wallace and Corporal John Doolin organized leagues, kept rough standings, and even held mock World Series games. The men bet cigarettes, shared jokes, and sang "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" in broken, tired voices. Oral history interview, National World War II Museum, 1978. When the guards ordered extra work or punishment, the games paused, never ended. The moment the labor ceased, a ball would appear again, hand thrown, dust rising underfoot. A ritual born from a bat, a ball, and a memory. For the Japanese captors, the Americans' refusal to break was inexplicable. They smiled too much. One guard was recorded saying after the war, "They do not act like defeated men." Allied war crimes interrogation. Tokyo, 1946. The guards didn't realize that. To these Americans, baseball had transformed into something sacred, a kind of invisible armor. Every inning was an act of remembrance. Every swing a prayer. Every run, a small victory over the void. As 1944 approached, camp conditions worsened. Rations shrank. Executions became more common, and diseases spread unchecked. But the games did not stop. Even as men collapsed from dysentery or fever, others carried them to the sidelines, letting them watch. A reminder that life still had rhythm, still had meaning. By then, the Japanese guards had given up trying to understand. They watched the thin figures running in the dust, their laughter echoing like ghosts of another world. To them, it was absurd. To the prisoners, it was freedom, and somewhere beyond the horizon, American forces were moving closer, through island jungles, across bloody beaches, toward the heart of the empire itself. The prisoners didn't know it yet. But soon, their strange games, those dusty, defiant innings under the Philippine sun, would become symbols of an unbreakable spirit that refused to yield. And when liberation finally came, the guards would learn the truth, that the Americans had never surrendered. Not truly. The clue to how they endured lies in that strange sight, the laughter, the bats, and the impossible joy behind barbed wire. Because baseball, even here, was war by other means. The Japanese guards. The baseball games remained a curiosity, a harmless ritual of defeated men. But beneath the dust and laughter lay something far more structured, far more deliberate. The prisoners had turned the pastime into a psychological machine, an invisible network of hope, discipline, and communication that would sustain them through the darkest months of captivity. The secret began not with officers, but with a handful of enlisted men, engineers, carpenters, and machinists, who realized that survival required more than endurance. It required order. Among them were Staff Sergeant Jack "Red" Hendricks, a former minor league pitcher from Iowa, and Lieutenant Robert Thorne, an industrial engineer before the war. Using the same ingenuity that once built bridges and engines, they designed a full league system inside the camp. Teams were drafted, schedules made, and standings kept on scraps of paper hidden beneath sleeping mats. Camp organization notes, recovered 1945. Every Sunday, the games played out with near-military precision. Each inning became a lesson in teamwork, hierarchy, and coordination, the very elements of soldiering itself. In a place where structure had been stripped away, the diamond became a headquarters of morale. U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Report, 1945. Even the tools of the game bore the fingerprints of American engineering. Baseballs were stitched from rice sacks, filled with crushed wood or paper. Bats were carved from chair legs or broken handles. One ingenious mechanic constructed a glove by sewing together fragments of Japanese uniforms, softening the leather with stolen grease. The camp's equipment officer, as the men jokingly called him, logged every ball and bat, ensuring no team had an unfair edge. It wasn't just play. It was precision under duress. Technical creativity flourished in ways few could imagine. A former Bell Labs technician, Corporal Gene Meyer, built a crude scoreboard out of flattened tin cans, painting inning numbers with charcoal. "We kept score like it was the World Series," he later wrote. "Every run was proof that we were still alive." POW letter, 1945. These small victories mattered. A U.S. Army morale study later noted that structured recreation reduced mental breakdowns among POWs by as much as 30%. U.S. Army Medical Division Study Number 88, 1946, in Cabanatuan. That recreation wasn't chess or cards, it was baseball. Meanwhile, outside the camp, Japan's war machine was fraying. By early 1944, Allied bombers had begun pounding supply lines, and American submarines cut off food and fuel to the islands. Yet inside the fence, something astonishing occurred. The prisoners began training again, not for escape, but for survival. Baseball practice became physical therapy for men recovering from starvation. Weak limbs regained strength through slow, deliberate movement. Pitching restored shoulder flexibility. Catching rebuilt reflexes. Red Cross Medical Summary, 1945. The guards still didn't understand. They watched with narrowed eyes as the prisoners, once barely able to stand, began to move with renewed vigor. To them, it looked like madness, a meaningless ritual of defeat. But the Japanese themselves had long understood the power of ritual. In the Bushido Code, repetition built strength and unity. What they didn't grasp was that the Americans had reinvented ritual for survival, turning play into resistance in one corner of the compound. Lieutenant Thorne kept meticulous records of every team, every game, and every player who could still swing a bat. He even sketched uniforms, labeling teams by unit number and hometown. When a man died, his name was crossed out, not erased. "We will play for him next Sunday," Thorne would say. Field Notebook, Thorne Collection, 1945. By June 1944, the league had expanded to nearly 400 men. The Cabanatuan World Series was announced, played between the Flyers and the Longhorns. The game lasted 3 days. Crowds of prisoners gathered, cheering softly under the watchful eyes of guards who couldn't comprehend the importance of what they were seeing. Eyewitness account, Sergeant James R. Steele, 1946. During those games, coded messages sometimes passed between players. A gesture, a word, a ball thrown a little too far toward the fence. Small signals that hinted at secret news. Allied landings, bombings, hope. Baseball became communication, disguised in laughter and sweat. The guards never noticed. Military Intelligence Debrief, 1946. The Japanese officer, Captain Mori, continued to file daily reports. Prisoners conduct organized play resembling baseball. Spirits appear high. No overt resistance. Camp Report, October 1944. His words, bureaucratic and detached, masked the reality. The prisoners had built a society inside his walls. That society had engineers, medics, cooks, and athletes. Their stadium was a clearing of dust. Their anthem, the rhythmic chant of men too weak to sing. But their morale was unbreakable. Then, in late 1944, the guards grew uneasy. Distant artillery began to echo from the west. The Americans were coming. No one knew when, but the ground trembled with the rumor. The Japanese tightened control, cutting rations and forbidding gatherings. Baseball was banned. The ban lasted only days to at dusk. Prisoners gathered anyway. One man tossed the hand-sewn ball into the air. Another swung. The crack rang out across the yard. The guards shouted and brandished rifles, but the Americans kept playing. The ball rolled into the dust, and someone laughed. Even the guards hesitated. How do you punish laughter? How do you suppress joy? Cabanatuan survivor testimony, 1945. The tension inside the camp rose. Guards grew violent. Executions resumed. Yet the game persisted in secret, under cover of night. Lanterns made from cans flickered as men took turns hitting invisible balls, playing by memory. We didn't need light, one survivor recalled. We knew the game by heart. Oral History Project, U.S. Navy, 1961. And then came one final match, a farewell game, as the prisoners called it. December 1944. A storm brewing overhead, thunder rolling like artillery. The men were thinner now, many barely able to stand. Yet they played. Each swing of the bat was slower but deliberate. One guard, perhaps moved by pity, didn't interfere. He stood at the fence, watching the ghostly figures in the rain. When a runner slid into third base, mud splattering across his ragged uniform, the prisoners erupted in cheers. Even the thunder paused. It was as if the storm itself listened. That night, several guards were overheard speaking softly among themselves. One said, "These men do not fear death." Another answered, "They do not fear because they have already died once." Interrogation summary, Tokyo, 1946, translated. The Americans had achieved what no weapon could, psychological victory. Each game, each throw, each cheer carved away at the image of Western defeat. The Japanese prided themselves on discipline, but here they saw another form, one born not from submission, but from belief. Behind the barbed wire, the Americans had redefined warfare. They had built resilience through rhythm, unity through sport, and communication through play. Baseball had become a hidden weapon, invisible, yet devastating to the enemy's assumptions. Soon, the echo of those games would reach beyond the camp itself. Allied intelligence reports, based on escaped prisoners' testimonies, began noting unusual morale and cohesion among Cabanatuan captives, far higher than expected for their conditions. War Department briefing, February 1945, that cohesion would soon be tested. In the months ahead, as liberation approached, the game that began as defiance would evolve into something far greater. The spark of a rescue mission that would stun the world, because when the Rangers came for them, the Americans at Cabanatuan were ready, physically weak, but mentally unbroken. Their bodies had starved. But their spirits? They'd been training all along. The Japanese guards never understood what baseball had done. But they would soon find out. January 30th, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. Night cloaked the jungle in silence. A silence broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the muffled click of rifle safeties. A column of men moved through the darkness, faces painted black, weapons ready. These were the U.S. Army Rangers, 121 hand-picked soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci. Their mission, infiltrate 30 miles behind Japanese lines and free over 500 American prisoners held at Cabanatuan. U.S. Army After Action Report, February 1945. Ahead of them lay the camp, a sprawl of bamboo huts and watchtowers guarded by hundreds of Japanese troops. The Rangers had intelligence from Filipino guerrillas and escaped POWs. They knew the prisoners were starving and sick, but somehow, still organized. Reports mentioned something strange, morale unusually high, daily routines maintained. One note even added, prisoners engage in baseball-like exercises, morale exceptional despite conditions. Intelligence summary, 6th Army, January 1945. Mucci didn't fully grasp it yet, but those games, that rhythm of survival, had forged the prisoners into something extraordinary. They were ready to act as one. Inside the camp, the evening was quiet. The guards had just finished roll call. A few prisoners huddled in the shadows, whispering about the last time they'd played ball. No one knew it, but that ritual had prepared them for tonight. It had trained them to listen for signals, to move together, and to trust instinct and rhythm. Baseball had become muscle memory for survival. At 7:30 p.m., the jungle erupted in motion. The Rangers crawled into position as a P-61 Black Widow night fighter buzzed low overhead, deliberately drawing the guards' attention. Then, silence again. On Mucci's signal, the first shots cracked through the night. The assault began. U.S. Army Field Report, 1945. The prisoners, startled awake, froze, then heard the unmistakable shout, "We're Yanks! Get down!" For a heartbeat, disbelief reigned. Some thought it was a trick. Others thought they were dreaming. But then came the truth. The gate burst open, and American voices filled the air. Men who had endured starvation, beatings, and disease for over 3 years now surged to their feet. In that chaos, something remarkable happened. Despite their weakness, the prisoners moved in groups, guiding the wounded, covering each other, and organizing with discipline. Later reports noted that former POWs displayed extraordinary composure and coordination during extraction. Ranger Battalion Debrief, 1945. That wasn't coincidence. It was training, not from drills, but from games. Baseball had built reflexes of unity that surfaced when it mattered most. When the firing stopped, 511 prisoners had been freed. Not one was left behind as they were evacuated through the jungle. A few men looked back toward the camp at the diamond-shaped patch of dirt where they once played. It had been more than their field of dreams. It was their field of endurance. Back in the United States, newspapers told the story of the rescue with awe. Rangers liberate Cabanatuan, hundreds saved, read the headlines. Yet few knew the hidden story of how those men had survived long enough to be rescued. New York Times, February 1945, psychological analysts studying returning POWs found something striking. Survivors from camps that maintained communal activities, especially sports, exhibited higher post-war resilience and lower rates of depression. U.S. Army Psychiatric Evaluation, 1946, at Cabanatuan, baseball had been that stabilizing force. It gave meaning to meaningless days and restored order to chaos. The engineers and medics who improvised the equipment. The game had been logistics. To the officers who scheduled matches, it was discipline. To the dying men who still crawled to the sidelines just to watch, it was hope. The Japanese guards, by allowing or failing to suppress those games, had unknowingly sustained their prisoners' fighting spirit. They thought we were wasting time, recalled Lieutenant Thorne after the war. They didn't realize we were keeping our souls alive. Interview, Thorne Collection, 1947. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers reveal how deeply this confused them. They were cheerful, said one. They laughed even when hungry. We could not understand. Allied War Crimes Interrogation, Tokyo, 1946. In Japanese military culture, suffering was endured through obedience. But for Americans, it was endured through community, and baseball was the ritual that built it. The psychological impact was profound. Allied analysts later wrote that morale was not merely emotional, it was operational. The cohesion fostered by those games meant the POWs could follow rescue instructions instantly, without panic. Strategic Morale Division Report, 1946, and beyond the camps, the story resonated with a nation weary of loss. When former prisoners returned home, their tales of baseball behind barbed wire spread through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Fans sent gloves and bats. Teams held tribute games. The 1945 World Series opened with a moment of silence for those who didn't return, and for those who kept the game alive in captivity. MLB Historical Archive, October 1945. Engineers who once built the tools of war now helped rebuild stadiums for peace. Factories that had produced bombs now turned out baseballs again. In Detroit, Louisville, and Chicago, workers signed their names inside gloves bound for returning veterans. To play again, one tag read, is to live again. American Legion Archives, 1946. The legacy of Cabanatuan reached far beyond baseball. In military academies, psychologists began studying how structured recreation and symbolic rituals sustained prisoner resistance. The U.S. Army's 1949 Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape (SEER) manual even cited the Cabanatuan POWs as examples of morale-based endurance. Army Field Manual FM 21-76, 1949. And yet, beneath the doctrine and data, the story remained deeply human. One photograph, taken just days after liberation, shows a thin, bearded soldier gripping a baseball in his trembling hand. The caption reads simply, "He brought it home." That ball, hand-stitched from scraps, it seems frayed, is now preserved in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Smithsonian Archive number 68 to 447, 1953. For historians, it's a relic. For those men, it was a lifeline. Decades later, survivors still spoke of the games with reverence. "When we played," said former prisoner Jack Hendricks in a 1972 interview, "we weren't POWs. We were just ball players again. That's how we remembered who we were." Veterans Oral History Project, 1972. In the end, baseball didn't defeat the Japanese Empire. But in those camps, it defeated something greater, the slow, consuming death of the human spirit, as the decades passed. Historians came to view Cabanatuan not only as a daring rescue, but also as a study in the invisible mechanics of survival, where sport, ritual, and shared identity became as vital as food or medicine. Modern psychologists call it collective resilience. The prisoners called it keeping the game alive. The Japanese guards never grasped what they had witnessed, how laughter, dust, and a homemade ball became the architecture of defiance. But somewhere in that confusion lies the essence of war itself, that even in cages, men will find a way to be free. In 1995, at a reunion of surviving Rangers and Cabanatuan POWs, a simple game was played once more. Old men with trembling hands threw pitches on an open field, the air filled with cheers and tears. The ball arced high under a fading sun, the same sun that had once baked the prison yard half a century before. When the final pitch was thrown, one veteran whispered to the crowd, "We never lost that game." Cabanatuan reunion transcript, 1995. And perhaps he was right, because in that prison, the Americans had found the purest form of victory, not measured in ground taken or enemies killed, but in hearts unbroken, spirits undefeated. In the end, baseball was not an escape from war. It was proof that even in captivity, the American soul refused to surrender.